mean, frigate-rigged ships, not galleasses, was a really big deal because you could make it around the Horn in under 2.5 months, go around Africa. And it was a big deal. They were trading all over the world. Tulips were the symbol of this. And having them with status, because there's nothing else like them in Europe. And the prices went up and up and up, and in 1 2-week period, that $500,000 thing that was up to 5,000, it just deflated like a balloon with a pin. And it didn't cripple the Dutch economy, but it did hurt a lot of individuals, just like dot-coms. And it's been repeated over and over and over. Teapot Dome impoverished tens of thousands of people because politicians had let it run up and faked it, and it brought down the New York government, in fact, at one time. It was Tammany Hall, and it was used to break Tammany Hall's power to a degree. Of course, Tammany Hall is responsible for getting a local independent Democrat who was screwing things up at the end of the 19th century by being such a loose cannon named Teddy Roosevelt in. And he ended up being president and really screwing them over real good. I may be it. Tell me I'm not alone up here.
There's still at least 3 or 4 more minutes.
There's 3 more people here.
Although
these rooms down here are very hard to find on the first day sometimes.
Tracy Hickman and Tracy.
yeah, I saw the list. By the way, probably the biggest screw-ups from the people of this would seem like a good idea on the shelves now. And they always ask me what I think is the biggest screw-up in all the ones, and there's a lot of them. I mean, they killed Caesar. They were patriots trying to bring the republic back. They started 600 years of dictatorships by doing it. But the intent was totally opposite. But probably the one that affected more people drastically than anything else, in 1915, a prisoner in Sweden that we know as Vladimir Lenin, in Switzerland, was freed by the German Tsar's secret police, put in a sealed train car, given the equivalent of several $1 million, and snuck into Russia to cause trouble for the Tsar to get him out of, because Germany was fighting in World War I. Effectively, the German Secret Service financed the Bolshevik Revolution and snuck its leader into Russia. This did not work out in the long run exactly how they
Worked in the short run, though. They got him out of the war.
Yeah, got him out of the war. He did exactly what he was an honest politician. He stayed bought as long as for what he was paid for. He did.
Of course.
I'm from Chicago. That's our definition of honest politics.
Of course, it was a year after the Russians pulled out that we came in.
Yeah, they pulled out in 17. We came in. Well, they pulled out in late 16. We came in 17. The Mensheviks had the power for 8 months. And then the Bolsheviks got in and cut a treaty conceding half of Russia, of White Russia, just to get out of the war, which fortunately, when the Germans lost against the French and us, they got back in Versailles.
Yeah, the Revere because of World War II.
But effectively, they financed the Bolshevik Revolution, which I like to remind my German friends of. Especially the ones from East Germany. Sidelight, not in the book. Do you realize that when Germany reunited, to Russ's dismay, I might add, after communism was collapsing actually, not entirely Russia, that the third most common aircraft in NATO was the MiG-21, because Germany had 457 of them once East Germany joined with West Germany. And after the F-16 and the F-14, it was the most common aircraft in NATO for about a year until we phased them all out and pretty much shut them down and put them in museums or in front of VFW. I don't know, the Germans have VFWs, but they got rid of them because they were still, they didn't weld their metal, they were bolting the wing metal still on the MiG-19. I mean, it was frightening. You wouldn't have got me in one.
They have
I've flown in an old Ilyushin, and it scared me on Russian Airlines. What?
I guess they have VOWs, Veterans of Our Wars.
Yeah. Gotta be. Well, good, you're the chairman and do most of the talking. Congratulations.
You know why you're here, right?
They had me scheduled for 2 different places, and this is where I live, so there I am.
I'm not supposed to be here, so I'm just gonna go back in the audience. And
Who are you?
Oh, no, I'm nobody.
I'm gonna give them 3 minutes and then we'll start.
That's okay, I'm doing stand-ups.
Okay.
Although, probably the most embarrassed man in history is one that most people are familiar with. He's the Archbishop of Serbia in the 12th century. And Serbia in those days they gave serfdom a bad name. Their serfs were repressed as only what we've seen still in the Balkans could be today. The Ottoman Empire was starting to grow and was a problem, and the serfs had less rights than slaves. They couldn't move, they could be killed by the landowners. It was incredible repression no rights whatsoever and abject poverty. It was terrible. Well, the Archbishop of Serbia decided that what they needed to do, he wanted to build his power up, I guess, was declare a people's crusade against the Ottomans, the Turks, who were a threat to Serbia. So they went out to the serfs and they found the 100,000 healthiest serf men. They got some sympathetic nobles. They got donations from all the churches. They armed them. They trained them. They taught them to fight in a war. And then they realized what they'd done. And this guy showed up from these nobles who had spent almost a year training this army, and of course were much more loyal to their men than the Archbishop at this point, and said, we're sorry, we decided this is a mistake. Send them back to abject poverty and total subservience.
You're right.
That's wrong.
3 years and 2 mercenary armies to put them down later. The Pennsylvania army finally succeeded. 30,000 burnt estates, 60,000 dead nobles, two cities destroyed, and the economy in a shambles. You gotta wonder what he was thinking. He served another 11 years. You can't fire an archbishop. So he was
Well, obviously, he wasn't thinking.
no, you gotta wonder who went to him for advice after that. You know, what are you gonna do next to really make a difference? Sort of makes Bush and Kerry look good, doesn't it? In fact, you know, that's the real consolation of that book. These guys can screw up so bad in the past, and we're still here and doing fine. So I guess we're going to survive whichever one of these both total blooming idiots wins.
I was reading that Lincoln had to be smuggled into the Capitol for his inauguration because people were out to kill him already.
Oh yeah, they were
I think
so
I remember.
irate.
Yeah, they were so irate.
Oh, come on, the Capitol's on the border of Virginia. And Maryland had riots trying to join, Maryland, Baltimore had riots trying to join the Confederacy.
I mean, the man was a saint in our minds, but at the time, people hated him probably as much as some people
He was unpopular basically up until his assassination.
Yeah, he was only popular 20 years later. Johnson and Grant made him look better. Being an American tourist. You know, they used to talk about the ugly American tourist, and I've traveled around the world a lot, and they love Americans now. And I finally figured out why they like us now. It's not our government. We don't spend that, you know, that, although we do tip better than most. There's two things that make American tourists look really good. German tourists and Japanese tourists. And God bless them, I like the people, like both countries. The Germans probably a little better, which is weird because I'm Jewish. But there's something when they get in other countries. The Germans insult everybody and don't tip, and the Japanese steal anything that isn't nailed down. I mean, they just assume the towels are gone. I've seen the mattress disappear from room 2 in Japan. I was standing at Heathrow, and they have piles of these forms you fill out before you go through security. And a Japanese tourist in a t-shirt goes, well, a grown man, maybe well, probably not as old as I am now, but he looked old to me because I won't accept how old I am. And goes by and grabs a stack of them on his way to the gate. Now, what are you gonna do with 40 or 50 tourist clearance forms for Heathrow Airport in Japan? They just, if it wasn't nailed down, they can pry it up. I mean, they were as bad as the American Army. We had armed guards with machine guns on the pyramids when the Americans were in Egypt. Because the British steal big things. They said the Americans would steal the whole country a brick at a time. Hey, you made it.
Yeah, we can't stay though, very long.
Well, then you do all the talking first.
Okay. Well, I'm against it, whatever it is.
Well, then I'll be for it.
All right, that's about the way it works, yeah.
Okay. Time to start the panel. Do you want to do the introduction?
Sure. That's why they give me the blue badge. I'm Hope McGrath. My staffer for the evening is Lou. And the panel is That's Not Sci-Fi. There's been quite a bit of discussion over recent years, and especially in the DragonCon circles, about the evolution of the genre and the fans of the genre. And as DragonCon has evolved, so has science fiction and fantasy. This is a panel about the pros and cons, or the protagonists and antagonists of fantasy within the science fiction genre. We have Lynn, is it Flewelling?
Llewellyn.
And she's the author of the Night Runner and Triad, or is it Tamir Triad?
Tamir Triad and the Night Runner series.
We have the Hickmans, who were the originators of Dragonlance. And Bill Fawcett, who is a game designer with Mayfair Games.
Was, yeah.
Right, and he wrote a juvenile science fiction series called Sword Quest. Is that
A
correct?
long time ago, also Crag's Claw, I had all the books, I packaged over 200 science fiction and fantasy books for publishers, major New York publishers. I'm also the author of a number of books on the Navy SEALs, and I also am half of Glenn Fawcett that does the Mycroft Holmes mysteries and the Lynn Flewelling mysteries.
And he published in Dragon very early on, didn't he?
Yeah, from the beginning up through the time I started working for Mayfair Game, a competitor of TSR, about issue 48. Suddenly my column and my center stuff disappeared in a flash of Will Niebling.
Just don't know how that happened. I heard that about Will, actually.
Head of the marketing. The irony being, of course, 2 years later when they fired him, we hired him. He now owns Mayfair Games. He bought us out.
There you go.
That is the nature of game
That is the nature of
industry.
game.
Yes.
Yell at or love fantasy in the genre.
Okay. Well.
I think we're a bit biased in
I noticed that.
that.
Fantasy sucks.
No, sci-fi rules, totally.
No
A
hard.
lot of fantasy does suck.
No hard science like warp drives and teleportation.
That's right.
It's a distinction without a meaning. There is more fantasy in most science fiction books than there is in most fantasy books. Most fantasy books, you just label it magic and settle for it. In science fiction, you fake it.
There's Clark's principle, right?
Which is?
Yeah.
Which is never write a book with a character in it. No, that's not Clark's principle. It could be Clark's principle. No, there's Arthur Clarke's principle, which says that any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic.
I
And
thought that was Asimov.
okay, it's
That's
Asimov.
Asimov.
Clark's principle is never to put a character in a book.
Oh, okay.
No, it's Asimov's principle, and so consequently, the difference between science fiction and fantasy is they're both speculative fiction. I mean, they both deal with other worlds and other times. One guy holds a sword, the other guy holds a blaster. And in terms of mythic structure, they're identical. Star Wars follows the Campbell monomyth almost precisely.
Intentionally.
And intentionally. That's what it's.
Explain the model myth. Where all this comes from one sort of inherent basis of the way we think in our culture.
Is there anybody in this room who doesn't know who Joseph Campbell is? Okay.
You know, we just finished a 2.5-hour writer seminar where we dissected the Campbell Monument. And so
You have 2 minutes.
We have 2 minutes.
The Cliff Notes, please.
If we'd only brought our multimedia presentation.
Yeah, we had great pictures.
Yeah, great pictures. Joseph Campbell, in his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, talks about, and a great book, if you haven't read it, go read it, talks about the monomyth. In particular, he talks about the mythic structure that exists in all cultures around the world, regardless of their sociological influences, for that matter, and regardless of their the message, the social message that they're trying to convey. The actual structure itself remains consistent throughout the world. The mythic cycle is readily recognized by anybody who deals in science fiction and fantasy. It's the foundation of all science fiction and fantasy. It starts with the hero character who starts at his home or a place that is familiar to him. He has helper characters that help him on the path toward his mythic journey. Then there's a threshold that he must cross with threshold guardians. The threshold guardians are there to keep out everybody else, you know, that isn't supposed to be in there, the truly heroic people. The hero crosses then from the realm of the commonplace into the realm of power. Once he reaches the realm of power or magic or mythology and the gods, he faces tests. He's helped along the way by assistants who help him pass through these tests, and if he endures and is great and is a heroic character, then he attains the goal, whether that's apotheosis or self-realization or there are a number of different goals that are possible. I mean, the golden fleece, if he gets the thing, then he goes through the journey back, the flight from the place of power, crosses back through the threshold and returns to the commonplace having attained the prize. This general structure is a very broad-based structure. This general structure is found in all mythologies throughout the world. It's found in Africa, it's found in China, it's found everywhere. The message changes from place to place. The names change, but the hero is still there no matter what face he has on. This is essentially the foundation of fantasy and the foundation of science fiction. You look at
Wow. You did that really well.
did I do that pretty well? You said I had 2 minutes.
I'm impressed.
Yeah. So
Sort of the Donkey Kong of science.
yeah, there you go.
So whether you're looking at Corwin or William in Braveheart, or whether you're looking at Achilles, or whether you're looking at Luke Skywalker, if you look until you get to the goal or what the goal is, the pattern is very consistent, even if you're a short hobbit, of exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And in fact, we keep the pattern and change the goal to fit our culture, or to fit the culture. In India, it would be, I can't pronounce the fancy word, it would be joining with the one, self-awareness. In China, it is generally peace and contentment and order. In our country, William West, in Braveheart, there is no one who had the concept of individual freedom whatsoever, even in Scotland in those days. I mean, those guys were out dying for their laird for the right to farm half an acre 100 years later. He would never have yelled freedom before his death. But we changed the mythos to fit our culture as it goes. His goal was screw the English and free the Scots and show that we could be ourselves again. And it wasn't nationalistic. He was going to benefit. And by the way, he had been a major mercenary in Europe for 22 years before that. He was an old guy and kind of crotchety.
but Mel Gibson didn't want to play that, so. The easiest way to illustrate this, oddly enough, is in religion. I'm a Christian, and so to me, I look at the mythic structure and I see the story of Christ, and it's all there. the epic journey of Christ, and his story is the story of the monomyth. At the same time, though, it is also the journey of Buddha. It's also toward enlightenment. It's also the journey of Muhammad, who also goes through the same mythic cycle structure. So, throughout the world, and for that matter, it's the journey of Shiva. I mean, throughout the world, the same structure is there. I personally believe that it is part of our hard coding, that it is part of our hard wiring, that it's the way we're built, that we are built to view the world as a story. And if no story presents itself, we frame our existence, our perceptions as a story. That's how we make sense of the chaos that's around us.
Even now.
And the horn too.
Is there anyone else who feels the lack of a soundtrack? I've always thought I should have a soundtrack.
Make your,
Well, for the sake of discussion, I'm going to play devil's advocate. I come from a slightly different angle. I mean, I do write high fantasy, and I agree with everything you said about the hero's journey, and I know that that is a motif that I was consciously aware of as I wrote, but I'm sitting here thinking of a lot of other fantasy. I'd like to open it up beyond the Tolkien-esque sort of fantasy that a lot of us are involved in. I'm thinking of Alex and Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange. I consider that a really good fantasy novel. I mean, it's sort of science fiction fantasy. Anybody read Clockwork Orange? Anybody? No. Oh, well, I'm going to make you a reading list and assign homework. It was a marvelous
How
book.
can we be at a convention full of guys?
And Nicola Griffith's work, the modern day, like magical realism fantasy, I think you can apply that template to it, but I think it's more complex than that. I think fantasy is evolving into something very, very contemporary to reflect our personal mythology, as you said. You know, the fantasy that is really hot right now, the fantasy that's winning awards, is not what I write. It's not the the high fantasy sword slinging magic user guys. It's the magic in New York City at the present time. It's the Buffy the Vampire Slayer sort of thing.
I've been writing fantasy for over 20 years now. I haven't won awards. I just write good story and hope somebody buys it.
Yeah, well,
Our
that's the
rewards
goal.
are signed by the publisher.
Every 2 months they send my reward.
Yep. Yep, that's good.
Question if I may?
But,
No, sorry, halfway.
You had a question?
yeah, go ahead.
Since you're all saying that it's all based on the same logical motif, even with or without any.
Well, I'm arguing that it isn't always, that you can impose that on it, but it isn't necessarily the motif that somebody's working for.
We're saying
What's the
that there's a
difference?
pattern to it.
What's the difference between sci-fi and fantasy? If it's all the same, only magic versus phasers, why are there two genres? Why do we still think about them as two different genres?
Actually, the real world explanation for that is really, really, really mundane and silly. And it has absolutely nothing to do with anyone whatsoever in this room. It's got to do with rack jobbers and salesmen. And the reason we have 2 sets of books, science fiction and fantasy, is to have more number ones on our list. Because when you sell books to major chains and bookstores, they look to see what is the top book on your list. So if I'm selling 6 books from Ace, because I was around when this happened, Jim Bain thought of this, and I'm around, and they're only, in the smaller stores, are only going to take my number 1 books. They take everyone's best sellers, their number 1 books. And if I have a science fiction number 1 and a fantasy number 1, they'll take 2 books instead of 1 from my list. And that's how we got listings of science fiction and fantasy. Between Jim Bain and Lester Del Rey, it was a marketing ploy to get more books on the shelves when it was hard to get our books out. And that's the only reason anyone makes a distinction today, and it's harder and harder to draw today, I might add as well, because we have contemporary magic that has science in it, we have science fiction that ends up with magical elements all the time.
So
And the distinction is less meaningful than ever before. And we have bestsellers thinly disguised as science fiction, like Michael Crichton in the back.
I took a sci-fi course back in college, and my literature professor in there,
How many books had he written?
none, but he'd read a few, I think.
Okay.
And he briefly went into fantasy a little bit, And I'm not necessarily sure if I agreed with this definition, but one thing he tried to teach us, at least that was the correct answer on the test, was that
That's important.
sci-fi was, at least the way he was taught, was classified as being a somewhat logical extrapolation on known science in our world. Like,
He doesn't read British science fiction.
but his belief was like Dune. I mean, it's very far set, and no one will. It has a lot of fantasy elements to it, but it's typically classified as science fiction. Is seen as somewhat maybe an extrapolation of many, many millennia down from Earth. Whereas he said that fantasy was always an alternate world kind of setting.
So Frank said.
But the irony of that is that, I mean, in my case, I have done years and years and years of real-world historical research, and I draw directly from the real world, and I do those same extrapolations to create I've heard that definition before, and I don't necessarily disagree with it, but I think fantasy has gotten pigeonholed, often by hardcore science fiction people, as the lesser of the genre. We're sort
I
of
think he was one of
ghettoized.
those.
Except it sells better.
Well, that's what makes them so mad. That's why they have to ghettoize.
No, we ghettoize horror, which helps those both of us anyhow.
Tracy got a letter the other day from a student who said he very much wanted to do Tracy. He had to do an author, study of an author, and turn it in and read, a certain amount of books by this author. And he said, and he wanted Tracy to be his author, but his teacher wouldn't let him because fantasy wasn't literature.
I've gotten those too.
Oh, yeah, we get a lot of that.
Yep.
I love that.
When you talk about doing research, when we wrote a fantasy series, Death Gate, and we did the magic system for Death Gate, I studied quantum physics and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and chaos theory, all of which is a pretty good foundation for magic, and crafted the magic system around quantum physics and chaos theory. So does that make me any less legitimate than in terms of?
Well, effectively, when you reach the quantum level and perception affects reality, you've moved from the realm of science to fantasy, and it is reality. That's the scary part.
Jeff Grubb's definition of quantum physics is figures, 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 open parentheses, and God does something. Close parentheses, figures, 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 figures.
God is black box.
Yeah, God as black box.
Generally, a distinction, if you're trying to define them, generally the way to try and figure out if something is a fantasy or a science fiction that people will classify is look to see what the suspension of disbelief is. In a good book, you've got a suspension of disbelief, and then you have things you automatically accept that don't count, like warp drive and stuff that are always thrown in as just parts. If it is a scientific variance, including because of this necessity, alternate universes, it's science fiction. If it is an element that is not explained by science, I didn't say it didn't involve science, it's not explained by science or scientific development of hardware, then it's probably fantasy, not science fiction. If it's got a piece of hardware, a premise, or an evolutionist presence, it's science fiction. It's science fiction. If it's got an unexplainable force or an alt-of-universe force, generally it's fantasy. And that's as close a distinction as you can make, because taking those two extremes, most of the books fall in the middle. And if you take Andre Norton's books, her fantasies had science fiction starts. Her science fictions have fantasy endings, consistently.
Ursula Le Guin.
Ursula Le Guin.
Good mix.
And then there is magic as a science. And then you get into psyops and stuff, and the distinction disappears.
I was going to say that I also took a overview to sci-fi and fantasy as a college course. My professor offered, though, instead of trying to define science fiction, he offered us a list of over 60 to 70 different definitions of what science fiction is. And then he basically proposed the question to us, what is science fiction? And for the course, he really just left it open like that. That it's kind of hard to actually really define, and that science fiction and fantasy sort of exist more on a continuum of how much is here and how much is here.
The reason that we call things science fiction and fantasy along with the marketing is because in the 30s, in the 20s, they had to have labels, and science was in. so it became science fiction. Most of the writers of that era didn't write science fiction, they wrote speculative fiction. They were very strong on the distinction. Asimov would give lectures on speculative fiction, not science fiction. He didn't call it that.
Can I
Okay?
interject something? And in fact, when you're being critiqued, when you receive a review, if they call your book speculative fiction as opposed to fantasy or science fiction, it's actually a compliment.
Yeah.
In
It
the
means-
review from the industry.
And it means the New York Times might check it. Okay? But New York Times is very selective. They don't want any bestsellers that they don't like. Their list bogus. Okay, the other thing is that because mythology existed, when you got your Barsooms and your things like that, they called it fantasy to fit it into a category of books that already existed, so they had a place to go on the shelves, a place to go in the libraries. And that's how the distinction got made at all.
This gentleman had a question.
I'm just curious, we always get into this discussion between what's fantasy and science fiction, and I always step back. How, going back even earlier, is it because of marketing that we've defined the categories? Because if you just take the word fiction and take mainstream, for example, Updike, the people in his books are a creation of his own imagination.
And
So,
they're
in
having
effect,
heroes'
they're no
journeys of their own.
different than the characters that you populate within your stories. And the richer they are and the more interesting they are to the reader, the more people hopefully buy them and are interacting with them. When did the separation start occurring?
In the
You start-
50s, and it was marketing. And it was for rack jobbers who can't read the books,
When did the
and
critics start
salesmen who don't.
deciphering it that way then?
Hmm?
When did the critics start, or the book reviewers started
When it became labeled
categorizing?
that way, book reviewers are sheep. When it became labeled that way, they began reviewing it that way, because it's set it on the back. And anyway, it's easier to categorize than understand. So anything that assists you in categorizing makes it easier to deal with, and that makes it easier to put it on the right place on the shelf, or to write a review of it, or anything else. So we drew the distinction, and that's why you have cyberpunk, new age, and all the subgenres. Not because it means anything to name them that, but because it helps to put a label on something to understand it, and particularly for people who are not writers or experienced readers, if you put a label on it, it makes it easier for them to either buy it or review it or something like that. So labels occur, and if they're not marketing, they're convenience.
I also think the distinctions are driven and powered by reader taste as well. I mean, I'm sitting there in a shopping mall behind a stack of my books, and people are walking by trying to figure out what I do. And they'll come over and say, oh, you know, what is this? And I'll say, oh, it's fantasy. And they'll either go, oh, I love that, or, oh, you know, their lip curls, oh, I don't read that. And I personally don't read a lot of hard science fiction, not because I think there's anything wrong with it, I just don't enjoy it. I don't read a lot of New York Times bestsellers. There are certain books that have come out in the last few years that got made into movies that I just thought were crapulous. And but it doesn't mean that that writer didn't work their guts out. It doesn't mean that that story didn't deserve to be between two covers. I just don't happen to like that story. And so I think fantasy and science fiction readers, there's plenty of crossover. And I read some of the older science fiction, but the real high-tech, hardwired, hard science stuff, I mean, I couldn't deal with that stuff in school. I'm not going to read it to relax. So I think marketing is absolutely huge. I mean, that is a very important factor, but the marketing is driven. The marketing isn't making you like one or the other. The marketing is responding.
We really need to apologize, actually, we have to go to, we're all double booked here and trying to dance on twice.
Oh, sorry.
Final word?
Thanks for
Final word?
Oh, no, well, science fiction, if it's got blasters and aliens, it's science fiction. If it's got swords and dragons, it's fantasy. If it's got blasters and dragons, it's probably really cool.
Or dragon with a blaster.
Or dragons with blasters. This isn't necessarily a final word because, you know, I leave you in Bill's capable hands here, and this is really a fascinating discussion. But for me, the objective is whatever classification, whatever slot or pigeonhole you put the story in, it's the quality of the story that's the important thing, less necessarily the chrome trappings of one or the other.
I was just gonna say, two of my favorite crossover books are Earthman's Burden. Oh my goodness, I can't remember the author. And then About Anything written by Christopher Stasha.
Oh, yes.
Who did Spaceman in Medieval Society, which I really liked.
Anyway, so thanks. Sorry we have to leave.
Thank you. Thank you.
Carry on.
See you later.
I had
Good to
a
see
lot
you.
of fun in your
Good to see you again.
college.
That have the heart in it, or the magic to a degree. When the element gets in front of the person starting from point A and going to point B and evolving along it and you follow it, or the person doesn't evolve, it's a bad book, because you're not following that pattern. And when the science is of more interest to the writer than the character development, we're too narcissistic to care about the science. We like people, so we read about people. Even if, I edit the Bolo series, which I'm pretty much done doing, the Bolo books, which are, 50 megaton tanks. These massive tanks, but they're people, because they think like people, they have emotions and everything like that. If you don't see them and the people around them evolve, I don't take the story, because they're boring. It's the ones where understanding evolves, where Bolo learns to spare the last of the enemy, the non-combatants in a war or something. That's a good story. When the universe is so neat it gets in the way, whether it's a TSR book or a hard science fiction book, they become really mediocre books. The novelty wears.
And then there's, forgive me for saying this, Michael Crichton, whose book Andromeda Strain was one of my very favorite science fiction books years back. But when my kids were little, they wanted to go see Jurassic Park. And the rule at my house is we have to read the book first and then you can see the movie. And then we get to bitch about how much they mess up the book. That's the real fun of the car on the way home. So my kids were pretty young at the time when Jurassic Park came out. And we weren't sure if they were old enough to go see it, especially the younger ones. But they really wanted to see it, so I said, well, we'll read the book first. Michael Crichton, oh boy, I haven't read one of his books in a long time. So we got that. And sitting there reading Jurassic Park out loud was painful. I'm sorry, I mean, if he's in the building, I apologize to Michael Crichton, because I do
It's
adore
not here,
him.
you're safe.
But the dialogue was wooden. The characters were repeatedly referred to by, like, the man in the hat. It was like Curious George, and the man in the yellow hat's in this. And I felt so sad, because Jurassic Park was a fabulous idea, and it made a really great movie. But the book itself, reading it out loud, I was really involved in how flat the dialogue was. It was all about the idea. The characters could have been anybody. I couldn't tell you names of characters. It's like watching Law and Order. I've been watching that show for like 20 years or 1,000 years, however long it's been on. I can't tell you anybody's name on the show. The characters are not front and center. I can tell you every character on Homicide, but not Law and Order, because the focus was so different between the two.
It was obviously a book written to meet a contract. It was a good idea, but he wrote it to get it done on time.
But it was.
And you can tell.
But my point was, it was a massive bestseller long before the movie ever came out. So, there are plenty of people out there that, cloning dinosaurs was enough. They didn't need the characters. Cloning dinosaurs was enough.
Not only that, does anyone else notice he's not a science fiction writer, he's a Luddite preaching a message? He hates science. He is afraid of science. He really uses science to create the evil he wishes to have in his universe. It's a Luddite. If he had a hammer and a bunch of mills, he'd go swinging through them. Luddites were a group in England who thought that the industrialization of England was cruel and evil and destroying their culture. They used to blow up and run through mills with axes and hammers, smashing all the machinery.
They were right, of course. I'll show you my Luddite print.
You're right. In the back, you've been patient.
I'm wondering if you've answered this already, I apologize. I'm wondering how you classify stuff like fairy tales as alternative history.
Those have to be science fiction because there is no element in it of fantasy, of suspension of disbelief requiring something other than the original premise that something in the real world happened differently.
Alternative history is almost its own category.
Yeah, it really, in a way, it's just a history
They would tell
story.
you that, I'm sure.
Oh, he has. He writes science fiction and magic into Legions of Videsios. He writes fantasy. He's written science fiction with hard elements in it. His alternate histories are historians having fun. And a lot of us do that. The Gettysburg books with Forstchen and Gingrich are just historians having fun. The alternates I've written in short stories primarily. Lincoln losing and becoming a general. Historians having fun. There was no element in it other than you just take the logical progression of the next thing. The reason that we have trouble distinguishing them is the easiest way to write a good science fiction book is take a period in history and just change the outfits. And I mean, you know, we're talking about Dune. I'm sorry, that's Constantine's empire. Right there, that's Byzantium. It was modeled on Byzantium. The outfits were Byzantium. The original descriptions were the ornate level of the Eastern Orthodox religion in Byzantium. Then you add your other science fiction elements. You take and learn from history and do things in history because it gives you a pattern, a progression against which you can tell the story, as Tracy outlined, of the change and evolution and of a human, of the border guards and of that. And on a very loose way, even in an alternate universe, if you stop thinking about the intriguing universe and start thinking about what's happening to either the group or a character, you get the same pattern. There are interference, there are guards, there's a transformation, there is an achievement, there is a final resolution. It is a pattern. An alternate history is simply a different set of guards, and what merely gives it its character is that we're using historical elements in a new way instead of science elements or fantasy elements. End of days, which is very much following the same pattern again, which I wish I could have got Tracy gone on, but got away before I could. And if you read those, it's an alternate history. With, instead of magic, the Christian mythos, and a little Islamic mythos, and a little Buddhist mythos thrown in. And the pattern is followed. But is there a distinction? Only in marketing. Who can think of a book that started and tricked you for the first 150 pages until you found out either the fantasy villain was a time traveler, or the villain that you've been shooting with a machine gun turns out to have been an evil creature from somewhere else? And of course, the difference between aliens and elves is what? Spock and an elf is. Tell that to Mr. Spock.
Sorry, this is, I'm not American, and this was the first time I've ever heard the term
Speculative fiction.
Yes. How does it interact with science fiction versus fantasy? What does it stand?
It was both.
That's
Speculative fiction, which is primarily science fiction, is what science fiction was called in the 20s and 30s. The term science fiction really did get popular until the later 30s. In fact, I believe Robert Campbell, the editor. John Campbell. Why am I thinking? Because we've got two Campbells in this conversation. John Campbell, the editor, pretty much promoted it with his magazine, which at the time was Analog.
Well, even farther back than that, Hugo Gernsback
And Hugo Gernsback
was calling it scientifiction.
Mm-hmm. And of course, 20 years ago, when I was starting in attending, if you use the term sci-fi or skiffy, you were an outsider and it was derided. And of course, now we have the Sci-Fi Channel and we love it and we've adapted it.
Oh, well.
Unless you're Harlan. Yeah, he's here, he can hear me, he'll beat me too. But then Harlan's one of the few people here older than me, so. He's 70 this year.
No way.
If I have his energy in 13 years, I'll be thrilled. Of course, he's one of my idols. Some of his behaviors I try not to emulate. He is one of those. If I could just name books as well as him, not mention write as well as him, I'd be thrilled. I mean, I have no mouth and I must scream. It's got a whole grab right there. I don't have to read the book to buy it. Question?
I was going to say, when you mentioned Luddites, it reminded me of a Harlan Ellison lecture that was put on Sci-Fi where he said he had to explain what Luddites. He had talked about them for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then he had to stop and explain to people. That's where he went on cultural illiteracy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
He gave the same talk like that on the Holocaust, but some people didn't even know that. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, there are amazing lapses when you talk to a general crowd. I talk to libraries sometimes. It's amazing. There are terms that you'd use every day that, or think about or have read about, but we're a literate reading group. I mean, you get spoiled talking to science fiction conventions. Go talk to the veterans of foreign wars. I mean,
Or high school kids.
because I do, or high school kids, because I do the Navy SEAL stuff and I do military history. You talk to these guys, and I can talk calibers and weapons types, and they understand it. But if I talk about anything in history that isn't their war, sort of scares you that they vote.
Yes.
And it explains a lot.
Okay, so the answer is, it's an artificial distinction created without meaning, and you don't like some of them anyhow. But it really comes down to personal taste to a large degree too, what you think is which. There are some science fiction books I consider fantasy because the premises don't have a derivation or they don't follow. And a bad book screws the whole thing up, because it has multiple premises. You're allowed one good suspension of disbelief in a short story, and one major and derived in a novel. And when they screw that up, you get books that you feel like they cheated you at the end.
Vern, science fiction or fantasy?
For his day, speculative fiction without question. Edgar Rice Burroughs, fantasy.
Oh, H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh, that's real.
Nonfiction.
You have never been to Vermont or Iowa.
League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Pardon?
The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen.
Oh, I love that movie. I don't know what they did with
Did
that.
you? I can't sit.
Incredible.
I can't sit by you.
Really? I thought it was just plain fun. I love the visuals. It's the same, what was Hellboy? Had the same crew, did it. And the visuals are beautiful in it. And it was just fun. I mean, you had to take it for a romp because it had absolutely no redeeming social value whatsoever. And it is without question a fantasy epic with trappings. Not a science fiction movie.
Sawyer in it.
What? Well, it worked because the one premise is that the literary characters exist. It had Quartermain in it, it had Dorian Gray. None of those people lived. I hate to break this to you. None of the major characters are real, and that's the only reason I can forgive them. Remember, I write Holmes stuff. Having Moriarty at the end, because they earned the right by putting all the other elements in there. But none of them were real. So what that was is, that wasn't either element, that was a pastiche. That was a tribute to the other books, more than anything else. It was Hollywood. You've had your hand up very long.
In publishing, since we have a fantasy writer and then the editor, is it harder for, well, not necessarily harder, but is there a very large distinction, did you feel, when trying to get a fantasy book published than if you could say it's a science fiction as compared to maybe regular fiction? Did you have a harder time of it because it's like, oh, it's fantasy?
You would, if you're getting any replies that, oh, it's fantasy from a mainstream editor, you're sending your book to the wrong place. You gotta do your homework. Agents, well, first of all, in my world, you get an agent anyway these days, but you should be pitching your stories to agents and editors that you've carefully researched that want your type of book. The fantasy market is booming as much as anything is booming these days. They still want new titles, they still want new authors. I believe that's the case with science fiction as well. But if you try to pitch your fantasy book to the mainstream editor at St. Martin's, you're gonna get a curled lip and a dirty look, but you should, I mean, that's just a real newbie mistake.
What is more important is the nature of the science fiction or the fantasy than whether it's science fiction or fantasy.
Yeah.
By what publishing house. What you're going to send to Bain, and it can be science fiction or fantasy. Look at Elizabeth Moon, who's written both for them. Is much more important that it's a Bain-style book than what you'd send to Daw, which is a completely different style of writing. Who do you send your books to? Look on your rack, see what you read is probably how you'll write. So you've got that. Also, because there is a science fiction and fantasy list, a specific publisher can be oversold in one area or the others, overbought, and have too many books. Particularly recently when they collapsed Rock into Ace and Avon into HarperCollins, and there's not many slots left to sell books into. You can have a brilliant fantasy but no slot for a fantasy for the next year and a half and not buy it. You can have a brilliant science fiction and not have a slot for a science fiction for the next year and a half and not buy it. And it doesn't really matter at most of the houses whether it is fantasy or science fiction. Neither is easier or harder to sell. It's the quality of the book and whether you happen to give them a book that they can put on their list is one they can sell. But it's the nature of what the book is about, much more than whether it's in one of the two categories in anyone's mind.
At what point does the sub-genres start to get too fracturalized? Like in the gaming industry, before, years ago, there was D&D, a few other TSR. White Wolf came in, took a share of the market, and now it seems like everybody and their brother is opening up a gaming company.
Well,
So-
it won't, because we're still only working with a few major publishers. And we'll never see the garage book thing that occurs in gaming. The difference is, you can sell 1,000 or 2,000 books. You can't sell 1,000 books and make money, not in paperback in particular. So you're never going to see a fragmentation of hundreds of little isolated little centers. And the second thing is, there aren't enough normally of each specific one to do your whole list on it. Even Misha Merlin, who's a growing press, has to have a wide range of books to move from Joel Rosenberg to what Bob and Jody are here signing now, the next Myth Adventures book. I don't think that's going to happen in publishing. Not only that, but since you have to sell 40% of your books to the major chains, they're never going to allow it, because they don't make that distinction. Then buyers don't have the brains. The guy who buys science fiction at Barnes & Noble used to buy the Christmas cards. They don't know anything of it. Since they got rid of Steve Pagel, they haven't had a single science fiction reader buying science fiction books, which has hurt us in a large way, but allows you to bullshit them too.
Ebooks, I mean, if they get big, and I
That's a
think some-
very big if at this point. I'm going to point out something. I've got a portable medium that's inexpensive, easily reproduced, doesn't cost a lot.
You don't care if you leave it on the bus.
If I lose it, I can easily replaced, hard to damage, and I can read it everywhere, and it doesn't require a power source.
And you can bookmark
It's a
it.
paperback. Why would I replace it with an ebook unless weight were a concern and I wanted several thousand so that I could put them on a CD? I mean, if I'm in space, if we all move into space and we're on stations and we have limited amounts, then ebooks make sense. Down here, at this point, until they get a book, something that I can't worry about if I leave it on the subway or not, I don't want an ebook. Because it doesn't do me, it's too hard, it takes away all the benefits of the paperback. I'm physically restrained, it's expensive, and they've all bombed.
Boy, that sounds like Luddite, isn't it?
Yeah, they've all, no, they've all bombed big time.
Yeah.
Every program's gone nowhere. Jim Bain gives his books, in fact, very honestly, Jim Bain gives away whole series of authors' books. You buy John Ringo's last book, you get everything John's ever written in his life, or Dave Weber, or anybody, for Bain Books. And the reason is, people read 3-4 chapters on the screen, their head hurts, and they go buy the paperback. It sells books to give them away electronically, which speaks not well for that future. Ebooks will only work when they become movies, and in which case we already have movies, we don't need ebooks. In the back, and then we're done.
Harry Turtledove and his
H.N. Turtletub, and other names, yes.
yeah,
Turtletub.
Harry Turtledove and his alternate histories.
We had that question.
Oh, sorry.
And the answer was it's its own genre. It's hard, if science, if you gotta label it, but effectively it's history, which is a different genre entirely. It's just playing with history, and I love it. And I admire Harry immensely, and I'm jealous as hell over some of the things he does.
I'm doing a little bit
In
of
his
that
fantasy
right now.
books where he does World War II with fantasy, I'm not so jealous of it. I think you get the final word, because I talked too much and then we're done.
I'm pondering why a convention called DragonCon is having this discussion at all. I'm not, this is my first time here, and you made it sound like the fantasy had sort of inserted itself into what had been a hard science fiction convention, but it's called DragonCon?
Yeah.
That's ours. Dragons, that's us.
Ed's had a minor inconvenience in Pat reads fantasy.
We love everything.
Well, thank you very much, and we appreciate your.